The Last of Us 2 is the best game ever made. Oh, no, of course not. That's The Last of Us 1. Do you believe me? You shouldn't, but that's how a lot of people felt at the time. The Last of Us was received like an ascension for the medium. Finally, it had happened. The first well-written video game. It wasn't the first well-written video game, but you could understand where the perception came from. Bias toward conventional forms of storytelling, ignorance of older and less accessible games, so distant from the current AAA scene. And one big difference, because most of the really well-written games were thoughtful, smart, the products of philosophy degrees and a tactical application of mental illness. What wasn't as common was a singular focus on character and real excellence in those terms. People talking the way people actually talk, a convincing human psyche, more than that, one that convincingly changed. Well, I doubt The Last of Us could really claim to have been the first, but it certainly filled a niche. The world had ended. Joel's daughter was shot dead. 20 years later, there's nothing left of him but a survivor. And a partnership with Tess, the only one he trusts. What's immediately interesting is what their relationship isn't. They're inseparable. They depend on each other. They know each other's past and they know each other's pain, and some nights they might have been more than partners. But they have not allowed themselves to do what you would expect people like that to do. They cannot allow themselves to love each other. So they hover in this strange post-apocalyptic situationship because anything real is just not worth the risk. And all that fear and pain and built-up strength is made visible to the player. A 20-year history of suffering suggested. We learn from nothing more than Naughty Dog's effortless hand with subtext what has become of love in this world. Not bad, huh? To survive in this world, a man's gotta have a code. Speaking of code, we're all nerds here. We want to learn tech. Well, Christmas has come early, my friends. All-in-one, structured learning, practical experience. That's what Boot.dev has to offer. They teach you to code, probably in your language, even the ones that sound like they were named by a drunk junior dev sitting on the keyboard. Boot.dev's lessons are as much about doing what you'll be doing on the job as they are about theory, so it's a lot harder to get bored, and there's a real sense of meaningful progress as you move up through the ranks. And if you're the kind of person who likes their learning motivated by a sense of community or gamification, well, that's what they're all about. Quests, bosses, a Discord, or not. Just put your head down. I was able to make something that technically counts as code in less than half an hour. So put your finger on the six-figure trigger, kings and queens. It starts with a link in the description and code WHITELIGHT to get 25% off your first payment. They were robbed. They need their guns back. And it's the Fireflies who make them an offer. Deliver a girl who haunts Joel with the image of his daughter to terrorists holed up outside the walls. Doesn't seem like a smart idea on account of the zombies, and the terrorists, and the trauma, but Ellie is immune to the cordyceps fungus. If they can get her to where she needs to go, then her immunity could lead to a vaccine. The world could be recovered. It's important that the danger of the task is as great and as clear as it is, so when Tess frames it as naked ambition to convince herself, and above all to convince a deeply uncomfortable Joel, that it's just another payday, we understand that there must be something more driving her than the promise of payment. Tess wants her life to mean something. Maybe it's the woman she used to be, atoning for the woman she's become. It's a selfish thing at its core, but that's what makes it convincing. That's what makes it believable that she would go to these lengths. And that's one of the reasons her death is so smartly timed. She's bit. It's over. Tess needs to die in this moment, to remove the buffer between Joel and Ellie, and force him to confront her directly, and to transfer her hope in Ellie onto Joel in the form of a dying wish. This is also the earliest point at which it would be impractical for Joel to turn back. He's come too far and he's being actively pursued. This is what makes The Last of Us good. The plot is written to convincingly create the conditions necessary to push the characters along their arcs. The characters are layered and interesting, the characters are convincing, and they change convincingly. It's good that the performances are among the best in the history of the medium. What's really important is that the game understands that people do what makes them feel safe. People don't change without being forced to. People don't change quickly. And when they do, that change isn't always linear. So when Ellie later saves Joel from a bandit, Joel doesn't thank her, and it doesn't bring them closer. Because in that moment, his hesitation to let the distance between them close is stronger than his gratefulness for his life being saved. So he scolds her and pushes her away instead. It is in the extended silence and tension after that moment that his defensiveness subsides, and he's able to take a step forward, to confront the fact that not trusting her is putting them both in danger. Even then, it's not "I'm sorry, Ellie," it's just handing her a gun, avoiding the need to expose any vulnerability in his cold exterior. superior. People don't make things harder for themselves than they have to be. Ellie is funny, optimistic, spirited, and helpful. She provides no excuse for Joel to dislike her. Much of their coming together is compelled by time and experience, Ellie cluelessly starting conversations about music or comics or whatever else, and Joel responding because if he didn't, he'd feel like an asshole. But they could linger in this state of mutual endearment forever. What the story needs to do to make Joel overcome his fears of getting closer to Ellie is to draw out a meaningful confrontation between him and that fear. So he meets a reflection of himself in Ellie, and with hesitation he gets close to them, and then he watches them die in horror, and that makes his fears bold. So now's the right time for him to come upon an excuse to listen to them. It's Tommy, his brother, who was always the better man. Under his belief that the world doesn't have to be a shithole, they're making it come true. Jackson is safe and strong and understanding. They're even turning the power back on. Joel wouldn't leave Ellie by the side of the road, but if he could convince himself that leaving her was in her best interests, that's what Tommy is for. He is Joel's excuse. In order to prompt a victory over Joel's fears that feels complete, his fears have to manifest completely, and he has to understand the cost of failing to overcome them. So the story allows Joel to go all the way. He won't just talk about leaving Ellie, he'll do it. Ellie knows it. She runs off. They have to chase her, and Joel tells her in a moment of pain that she'll never be his daughter, and he'll never be her dad. He doesn't really want to leave her. He didn't really want to hurt her, but he did. And it's the guilt that festers in the background that brings him back to Ellie, the pain of leaving her now being greater than the fear of being close to her. It makes sense, but this is one of the weaker beats in the narrative. I don't find it to be honest to Joel's character that in, hours after he let his pain overtake him, feeling guilty over a heartless scolding would be all it took to commit himself to Ellie for the remainder of their journey. But having made that commitment, the game doesn't need to show us Joel and Ellie warming to each other because it's already made us understand why that would happen. This is the usefulness of the time skip. Sometimes people change in the long silences of days, weeks, and months. What does need to happen is for us to see the result. Joel, for the first time, initiating conversation, the thorns in his voice retracted. And then what needs to happen is the next push. Joel is wounded, and Ellie has to spend the following months alone, fighting for his life. That fight makes a useful statement. It raises our investment in their connection to recognize that Ellie needs a father as much as Joel needs a daughter. Unfortunately, this chapter suffers more than most from a clinical case of being stupid as shit. David, with his pedo voice and being a pedo cannibal, feels too cartoonishly hateable for a world so grounded. And when Ellie is attacked by his men hunting for Joel, Ellie hopes to draw them away by appearing on horseback just before they find him. But would that not simply confirm that they were looking in the right place? Her plan hinges on the assumption that every man who noticed her would give up on the guy they actually want revenge on and pursue her instead, just because David asked them to. Eventually, Joel wakes up, now confronted with a new fear, not of being too close to Ellie, but of being too far away. The next big push. It's the fear of feeling what it felt like to lose Sarah that pulls Ellie into Sarah's shoes. When Joel finds Ellie giving David a London makeover, he pulls her away, pulls her close, and calls her baby girl. She's now the child he could never save. In this moment, invested with the love of a father for his daughter, Joel's character arc is complete. But the game wants to mean more than one man's healing. It wants to be deeper and truer and more resonant than that. It doesn't want to be a good story, it wants to be a great one. So another time skip to the hours before their final destination. It's bright here and calm, and it feels so profoundly cathartic for the tension in Joel's heart to be released at last. And that's why we had to feel it now. We're finally happy. We don't want to see them apart, but that's what the Fireflies will bring. This is how the game keeps hold of its narrative tension. The meaning of Ellie's moment with the giraffes is so that she can recover a precious fragment of her stolen childhood, and so that Joel can see it happen. It's the push he needs to open his mouth, to just tell her that they could turn back right now. But Ellie needs her life to mean something, so they don't. Ellie almost dies and Joel is knocked unconscious. When he recovers, having been rescued by those we came to find, we're unallowed to meet Ellie before the surgery begins. We don't know if she's okay. We didn't even get to say goodbye. This can't be how it ends. That's where the story has us, building this immense sense of frustration. The writers play into the convenience of the Fireflies arriving at the exact moment Ellie needed help. It's framed as a miracle, proof that this was meant to be, as if the world was moving to right itself. And then Joel learns that a vaccine would cost Ellie's life. It's what she would want. It's what the world seems to want. It might even save the human race. All that good is built up to make Joel's brutal defiance seem all the more monstrous. He kills every living thing in that building. He betrays Ellie's chance to matter, but the narrative has brought us to a place where we understand why he did it. And this great evil is to us right. In this moment, we're made to know that if we were faced with a choice like Joel, we might do the same thing. Love. That's what The Last of Us wants to explore, and these are the truths it wants to expose. We'd all do anything for the ones we love, so we do any harm to the ones we don't. To what degree can love and empathy coexist? A man dooms the world to save his own, and we can't even bring ourselves to judge him for it. If what's right is what's wrong, is there really any hope for humanity? As Ellie recovers from her anesthetic, Joel tells her a story, and Ellie can't help but see the holes. She makes him swear it, and he does. But what matters is her response. Okay. Perhaps Ellie is too disappointed in him to fight, but I believe it's truer to the game's ideas that in this moment, Ellie makes herself believe him because she loves Joel and she wants to keep him, so she'll believe his lie. Push it down, make it quiet, hide from the gaps in his story that spell out an evil, for the exact same reason he did it in the first place. Ellie's self-delusion is motivated by the same thing as Joel's killing. And in having someone so different from him make the same choice, the game fully universalizes its message, ending on a statement that it could have been any one of us. We're not told what to make of this, we're simply left with the examination to decide for ourselves. It is not the task of art to know the answer, it's the task of art to show us the truth. That's why The Last of Us is The Last of Us, and not some pretty good game from 2013, did you ever play it? And that would be true if The Last of Us was a book or a TV show, which it is, but above all, The Last of Us is a game, which is where things start getting heated. The Dark Knight gets shit these days for inspiring bad trends in comic book movies, which I've never really been on board with, because you're basically blaming it for being too good. It's not the Dark Knight's fault that other movies rightly thought it kicked ass, wanted to be like it and weren't. If there's a Dark Knight of games, it's The Last of Us, because people think it inspired a trend for which it is resented, of games becoming less like games and more like movies. Games that might leave you with a feeling that their creators believe that their work would not be serious nor be taken seriously if they did not become more like film. Lots of cutscenes, that's part of it, an absence of choice in the narrative, a fetishization of realism, and a willingness to sacrifice control in order to protect it, a serious tone, a drawn-in camera, conventional storytelling methods put ahead of those best suited to the interactive medium, and above all, story put before gameplay. It's a denial, a betrayal, an insecurity in the strength of the medium. Well, is it? Sometimes. I understand the resentment. Gamers desperate for the respect of film, while proudly holding on to a child's understanding of their own medium, and believing art happens when a man is sad. Or the cinephile, judgmental, clueless, somehow even more insecure about what the media they consume says about them, and whose ego might shatter into 1,000 pieces if they were ever to learn how many games there are that have far more to say and say it far better than the latest Paul Thomas Anderson film. Elden Ring is a moving work of art that could only be a video game. The Last of Us is a moving work of art that would work pretty well as a TV show too. Should it really be the image of what a good game looks like? No. And to whatever degree it served as a bridge between games and respect is embarrassing, but we don't have The Last of Us to blame for that, nor to credit for its role in pushing big-budget games to take writing seriously. I think The Last of Us is better than almost everything it inspired. I think The Last of Us has struggles with being a video game. I don't think there is anything wrong with video games interested in conventional storytelling methods, but here's the cool part. I think it is better as a game than it is, or than it would have a decent chance at being, as a film or a show or as anything but what it is. A video game. How can interactivity change how you relate to a character? Lessons from the Screenplay calls it empathy through control. I think that's basically true. In the form of an objective, a game tells me what to want. Then, the story tells the protagonist to want the same thing. I want that guy dead, Joel wants that guy dead. In that sense, we understand each other. I like it when Joel gets what he wants, and I don't like it when he doesn't, because that's sort of what a game is. When he's in danger, I feel his tension, and when he has to expend effort, so do I. It's a fundamental empathy. The mechanics of the game provide characterization. By making us participate in extensive resource scavenging, the game defines what Joel thinks about, and we begin to see the world like him. And it's the interactivity inherent to those mechanics that make room for the player to express his character on their own terms. I do this without thought or incentive, because what it ultimately means to control Joel is to become Joel, to interact with the game as though I were him. I find myself walking more like Joel, raising my gun as an expression of his paranoia, or making a killing more brutal than it had to be as an expression of his rage. Since these moments are not authored, to this degree I am also interpreting Joel. The game understands this, and presents specific opportunities to make interesting interpretations. When Ellie asks if I've got a sec, I can choose to listen or not to. Does Joel tell Bill what Frank thought of him, or keep the letter hidden? How long does Joel spend with Ellie and the giraffes? You can see how by participating in Joel's psyche, making emotional, character-relevant choices as him, for him, in the name of the him I'd like him to become, my connection to him may strengthen. None of that makes Joel a compelling character, and none of it makes the story good. But it does make it easier for the story to be good. I'm more immersed, I'm more invested, and I care a little more about what happens next. The big problem with boiling it all down to empathy through control is that it doesn't account for characters who you don't control, and with The Last of Us, that's kind of the most important part. We have to connect to our companions. How? Good question. Metro is kinda like the Slavic Last of Us. As you can imagine, it's terrifying and unpredictable. So when I am with an NPC who can shed some light, who can show me the path, who can lessen the tension, I attach to them. I attach to them because I depend on them. When we're apart, I feel deeply exposed, and when we reconnect, I'm deeply relieved. I don't even need to like them that much. A strong connection is built through presence alone. The Last of Us has it harder. Its world is familiar and realistic, its zombies are rational and demystified. Every part of that description lends itself to predictability. And adding to that, Joel is a capable guy. It's a dangerous world, but I know what's coming, and I don't really doubt my ability to survive it. So how valuable can a companion be? Well, they can still help me win a fight, and even if the fight isn't hard, whatever effect they have builds trust. They could help me find the way forward, and that could very easily make it feel like the designer thinks I'm too stupid to find it myself, but it doesn't, so I'm grateful. They might hand me some ammo or a med kit, and since I always need them, I'm thankful for that too. It's a basic idea. If I'm struggling and someone helps me, I like them for that. Games by nature can pronounce those struggles in a way other mediums can't, so they're in a strong position to build relationships through play. The clearest example of that are obstacles that require cooperation to overcome. There's a ledge that's too high, so I give Ellie a boost and she brings me a ladder. What's interesting is that it works the other way round. You're made to take on the role of a protective figure by helping Ellie cross bodies of water she can't swim across. You're made to mechanically understand her as someone in need of care. And Naughty Dog are able to achieve that without the frustrations of escort missions because it minimizes the role of AI. What's unfortunate is that they're repetitive, which gets boring, which gets annoying, and that's not to mention how often these situations are visibly contrived to make the puzzles feel dramatic and to make Ellie's cooperation necessary. We're trapped in a building. We need a way out. We're in a universe so grounded that its behind-the-scenes video is named Grounded. So what are we gonna do? Unboard a window? Don't be stupid. Push a massive, loud-as-shit piano closer to a ledge so Ellie can pull us up, and then just sort of hope that'll lead to an exit. Why didn't I think of that? Or what about this ledge? Looks pretty climbable, Joel. Apparently not. Let's dive into a lock, find a shipwreck, dislodge a pallet, bring Ellie over to the ledge so she can climb it, then rely on the strength of a 14-year-old girl to twist a rusted crank. And in reality, if you were in a room with a blocked doorway, you'd just unblock the doorway, instead of jumping out a window and shimmying along the edge. But it's a tolerable problem, and one worth suffering. Movies don't get to benefit from interactive relationship building. A less obvious advantage of games over film is realism. Games can't record reality, but they can allow you to fully inhabit the space they portray. It's a new reality, not just a picture of one, so they're more transportative by nature, and they find it easier to make strong use of space. It's hard to think of a better example of that than when you're walking through that idyllic suburban neighborhood with Henry and Sam. If you want to reflect on what life must have been like in a place like this, it's helpful to actually exist in it. Games can also make things engaging that would more likely be boring in a passive medium, and therefore would not likely be seen. Two people spend 5 minutes walking. That's hard for a film, but much easier for a game, because in a game you're engaged by moving and by looking and by deciding which way to go. What's made easier to access by both these things is a large dimension of real human experience that is typically excluded from film and TV. And along with that, a big part of how humans interact with each other. The necessary space is made for Ellie and Joel to chatter away about trivial bullshit, and there are appropriate moments of silence between. A subtextual awkwardness can hang, an air of tension or relief can build and settle over a longer period of time. And there are many more opportunities across these larger scenes for smaller interactions with companion characters that all add something valuable, even if they wouldn't be enough to make it into the script of a HBO show.
I'm whistling.
Oh, good. Something else you can drive me crazy with.
Space, being the medium's natural strength, takes on most of the responsibility of world building. I'd go as far as to say that one of the strongest things that endear us to Ellie is her curiosity. She asks a question, she reveals her innocence in doing so, which probably activates some kind of paternal impulse. Joel bonds to her because he has to answer. And I think in some way we feel some sort of identification with her, or an appreciation of her, because she's asking the questions we want the answers to. She's acting on our behalf. Scavenging ties exploration into a behavior that makes sense for the protagonist to engage in, and the resource pressure means thoroughness is likely, if not assured. Even though it's not what comes to mind, moving through interior space is as much The Last of Us as its combat or its stealth. A neighborhood is a region of gameplay. A house is an encounter. The imagery and the atmosphere of those things have a long time to settle, absorbing through the skin like the faintly lit dust. And they come to be the defining presence of large parts of the game. We sit with the abandoned ruins of lives much like our own. A silent street, an empty house, a diary abruptly ended. The level of detail characteristic of Naughty Dog games makes itself most useful when painting a clear picture of the people who made up these families. We see their innocence, their childhood, their panic, their undeservingness of this. We see ourselves in this apocalypse, their lives so like our own. We wonder if they made it, and we wonder if we would, if we could be like Joel. Obviously, this adds depth to The Last of Us, believability, and it's interesting that it makes up so much of the game, but translates so weakly to the show that it is barely even there at all. That loneliness, that emptiness, the beauty of it, and the horror. It's against these feelings that Ellie makes herself emotionally valuable. The Last of Us might not be scary, nor is it strange, but it is really lonely, and so you're grateful to have the company. You're made to feel the value of this connection. Do you still think it's accurate or fair to think of The Last of Us and demean it as a movie game? Do you really think it's a rejection of the interactive medium? I think The Last of Us would be good in any form it was told, but it is as good as it is because it is a video game, and we are lucky to have a passive telling to see what's lost when it isn't, and what's gained. Come on, this was never going to be that simple. Why don't we start with the safest question? Is the combat good? The Last of Us wants fighting to feel grounded, right? Brutal, tactical, gritty. The things you'd expect to feel in a world like this, as a man like him. It also wants fighting to not be boring, which is the risk you run with high ambitions to realism, and especially from Naughty Dog, being so accustomed to hard cover mechanics. The Last of Us has soft cover mechanics, and no interest in keeping you in the same place for more than a moment. Enemies flank, which makes them feel intelligent, which makes the world feel more plausible, and which heavily discourages stillness. Enemies always have an opportunity to flank, and you do too, because the level design allows for circular navigability, which means there are always a number of defended pathways that lead around the entire arena. Movement here is being used for its simplest purpose. When we're playing a game like this, we want interesting decisions, and the best way to keep decisions interesting is to keep us moving so that the organization of enemies and the environment keeps changing. Most of the rest of what makes up The Last of Us's combat is about pushing that further, making movement decisions as interesting as possible. What's useful is that movement is as intuitive as possible. As a concept, it requires no explanation. We all understand and possess an intuitive feel for how positioning would work against human enemies in a realistic world. And that makes The Last of Us a very intuitive game, very easy to learn, which is good, obviously, and impressive, because there's really not much else like it. Most visible of its oddities has got to be the aiming, which might be better called the hoping. Weapons are inaccurate, and there's a huge amount of weapon sway, which makes it really hard to hit your shots. That means a lot of things, but the thing it means the most is a heavy preference for close to mid-range, where inaccuracy and weapon sway matter less. This accelerates the pace of movement, and because Joel is fragile without regenerating health, it is extremely important to not be exposed, so this also complicates movement. You have to strike the most successful balance between safety and closeness, which is harder to judge and constantly changing. More interesting decisions. How do we keep them interesting? Well, we keep changing what a successful balance looks like. Healing, crafting, and weapon switching require a period of stillness, a period of vulnerability for which you must secure a much longer than usual period of safety. Interesting because you're almost always near the danger. On the other hand, the strength of melee and the usefulness of grabbing enemies to use as shields momentarily shift the balance in the opposite direction. Weapon differences can achieve the same thing, because different weapons prefer different ranges. Switching is encouraged because the environment changes as you move, but what demands it is the fact that ammo is extremely limited, so it's something you have to do. You're scrolling through a roster in each fight of weapons with completely different characteristics, driving completely different behavior. Switching to a shotgun in a close-range environment isn't that interesting. Being forced to use a sniper? Now that's something new. It's generally a good sign for an interesting weapon roster when weapons can be understood as exceptions to a rule. Every weapon has a strong preference for close to mid-range, except for the hunting rifle. Every weapon is loud. except for the bow. No weapon supports reckless aggression except for the shotgun. The sawn-off shotgun can't really be understood this way. It's a confusing addition, and it's no surprise that it's absent in the sequel. It'd be easy to think the same thing of the revolver and the pistol, there being so little difference between the two. But I think the reason you get them so early is to get you used to the weapon switching mechanic. In a serious game, you could only carry 2 weapons. Those were the rules. 3 weapons? You're pushing it, mate. This ain't Tom and Jerry. All your weapons was not the expected move from the most serious game in the world. But Naughty Dog found a way to make it believable, basing it all on a technology that actually exists in real life. A bag. Some weapons are equipped, which means you can switch to them quickly. The rest are stowed and require a period of vulnerability to equip. That's pretty much a description of how backpacks work in real life. So there's another part of The Last of Us that's extremely easy to learn. And so now the world's most serious game has the benefits of Doom. A full weapon roster in every fight. More to choose between, more for the fight to be varied by. But what's remarkable is that we keep the design benefits of limited weapons. Since only some weapons can be equipped, there remains the element of preparedness, planning which weapons to take and which weapons to stow, given what you know of the coming fight, or the coming section of the current fight. Weapon switching is interesting, weapon selection is tactical, weapon variety is maximal. The Last of Us can have it all, and they can have it all again. Stealth and combat are sort of the same thing in The Last of Us. We slip behind a wall or out of a window, we recover a state of non-detection as we intuitively expect to, and it is in these moments that we can begin a flank or set up a trap. We are continually returned to a state in which tactical planning is best enabled. But your ability to make those plans depends on your access to information. Where are the enemies? How many are there? Now, modern stealth games that like to think of themselves as sandboxes will gladly provide you with X-ray vision and permanent enemy tagging to make complete awareness a fast and frictionless affair. We can immediately make our plans, short-term and long-term. Creativity is encouraged, and combat is made to feel tactical. But there's a price to be paid. Stealth loses tension because tension depends on the unknown. It lessens variety because surprises that elicit novel, improvised responses from the player are so much less likely to happen. The Last of Us doesn't want to pay that price. It wants a tactical element without sacrifice to tension or surprise. So your basic sources of information are what you can see, which in tight, complex arenas is generally not much. And enemy callouts, which serve the dual purpose of suggesting higher intelligence by creating the illusion of cooperation and suggesting their location, a vague idea, which keeps tension in the game. Then the game introduces listen mode. It's like detective mode, but without the Wayne Tech budget. So it has a limited range, your movement is slow to a crawl, and you can't use your weapon. Under constant pressure, that means you can't use it safely, and you'll mostly use it briefly. That makes it balanced. And that's what leaves us with a detective mode that doesn't nullify tension, both because it preserves the unknown, and also because using it is its own risk, which is also what makes it interesting. Like healing or swapping, listen mode demands you make the decisions necessary to secure a period of safety, which is like the 5th thing that does that. The Last of Us keeps leaning on this idea because it understands that pairing vulnerability with a limited information environment is going to result in a really tense experience. So we hold on to surprise, if anything we gain tension, but we're allowed a glimpse, brief but long enough into certainty, to make larger plans, to make that kind of interesting decision too. It's brilliant design. Here's a fact. Limited information means things are going to happen that you couldn't account for. In effect, that means randomness. Most consequentially, that's true of the aiming. You'll miss, and sometimes it won't be your fault. But why is that not frustrating? It's not frustrating because mechanics don't exist in a vacuum. If my Doom Eternal power fantasy is ended due to random bullet spread, the experience is undermined. In The Last of Us, it doesn't undermine the experience. It reinforces it. It pulls us further in, to a world of suffering and a world of harsh realities. So this is also true of failure of any kind in combat. We all accept that gameplay and story affect each other. More rarely discussed is that therefore the same is true of skill. In some games, power fantasies in particular, being bad can feel like more than a mechanical problem. It can feel like a misalignment with a character, a failure almost to fulfill the role or to live up to the story, and that can do harm to the experience. Challenge and accessibility, then, more easily go hand in hand when a way can be found to make failure acceptable or even productive within the fiction, and that's exactly what The Last of Us does. Doubling down on the immersive impact of aiming is the fact that you have a big incentive to not miss, because bullets are so valuable. With every lined up shot comes a tension, and so an awareness of the world beyond the fight. It's when the fight is done that you feel the consequence. If your stocks are high, then you're compounding your advantage, and there's a sense of pride. If they're low, then scavenging takes on a desperation, and you feel exposed. It's a magnification of the satisfaction of success or the weight of failure, and an extension of the meaning of combat beyond its beginning and end. We could think of weapons that require resources to craft in much the same way, like the Molotov or the nail bomb. Grenades are a tried and tested way for a shooter to expand depth, but The Last of Us places an expected emphasis on using them wisely, because they don't come cheap. Now, in most games, that'd mean not using them at all. We're all familiar with the curse of consumable items, but once again, The Last of Us manages to have it both ways. You are compelled to spend them with care, and you are compelled to actually use them. Firstly, by carry limits. You can only carry so many resources and so many crafted things. So in order to access the reward of scavenging, you have to craft, and you have to use what you craft. Secondly, there's the potential of a crafted weapon to save ammo. A well-placed nail bomb could save as many as 9 bullets. That's a pretty big deal. And then there's the fact that the game is quite happy for you to run out of ammo entirely, which in The Last of Us is a sudden and novel demand to fight with melee, bricks, bottles, and of course, with crafted weapons. So you will consume the consumables, and their contribution of depth is secured. What works just as well as the crafting itself? Resource management. Simple idea. Different things require the same resource, so what to choose, what to lose. The Last of Us wisely fragments these choices into pairs with the most interesting trade-offs. Nail bomb or Molotov? Not that much difference, not that interesting. But Molotov or health? Both very useful, both very different. So it's Molotov and health that require the same resource. The second grouping is nail bomb, instant melee kills, or instant stealth kills along with access to special doors. Now we're talking. Call me Tom the way I be using Shiv. Fragmented resource requirements and limited resources means you can't keep crafting the one thing you're most comfortable with. You craft what you can, so you're likely to make use of the entire roster. Smoke bomb is obviously weaker than nail bomb, but it's never smoke bomb versus nail bomb because they don't require the same resources, and there'll be plenty of times when I don't have a nail bomb to use instead, or I want to save the one I do have for a better opportunity. So I'll use smoke bomb too, and I'll benefit from how it changes combat in an interesting way. As you can probably tell, I am impressed with combat in The Last of Us. A game's quality is not equal to the intelligence of its design, but goddamn is Naughty Dog's game design smooth. With a VE, it's exciting, it's refreshing, it's intuitive, it's immersive, and I'd give it like a 7.5. It's good as a foundational set of mechanics, and it's good most of the time. Which is good because it's used a lot of the time. There is a lot of combat in this game, which means combat has to remain interesting for a really long period of time. The reason I call the combat good, and not some prettier word, is the same reason it doesn't quite have as much longevity as would have been ideal. They did plenty, but they could have done more. You could say they should have made the mechanics deeper, or added more deep mechanics, just as easily as you could say there should have been more variety, more things to prompt new, interesting decisions, more weapons, more craftables, more enemy behaviors, more varied levels. It could be all these things, or any one of them, but I think the only one of them that absolutely should have received more attention, that is visibly problematic in its current state, is the level design. When the combat is at its weakest, the most obvious reason for that is the level design. Level design is depth. If we define depth as the sum of your relevant balanced options, then that makes sense. What am I looking at if not relevant balanced options? So it is important that it is good, and it's impactful when it changes. Well, it is good, but not that good. And it does change, but not that much. They're small, almost all of them. Perhaps a limitation of the PS3, so there's only so much possibility they can provide. Verticality? On occasion. And on those occasions, it's 2 elevations instead of 1. It can't have been easy to design compelling arenas that are also believable spaces. Maybe that's the reason that some arenas are just bad. I still don't know how the fights in Jackson made it into the game. What is happening here? None of what makes the combat good is able to express in an environment this constrained. When the combat is not good, it's not good because of the level design. The Last of Us gets harder by raising the enemy count, but the arenas don't get any bigger, and what that does is push against what everything else in The Last of Us is trying to do. It makes it very hard to move without exposing yourself, so you move less, or you don't move. You find the first safe place and defend it, because if you don't, you'll probably die. You know, I was so looking forward to the final fight of the game. I'd heard about it, seen it discussed time and time again, and I wanted to know how it'd feel to have that rage, that desperation to save Ellie from her destiny expressed through play, sprouting from my own hands, driven by my own feelings for her. It was quite a thing to learn how the fight actually plays. There's like 20 guys repping AKs stuffed inside a hospital ward. You have no choice but to sort of sheepishly peek round corners. That aggression, that monstrous single-mindedness, it doesn't come through at all. And as a side note, what were they thinking putting Marlene's audio logs here, man? The premise of the moment is that Ellie's about to have her shit cut clean out any second, so now is perhaps not the time to stop to listen to an audio log. So I either miss out on valuable information, or I undermine the experience. that's not great design. The bigger narrative problem is Ellie. Much of the gameplay has been about bonding you to Ellie, but the moment someone fires a shot and she would plausibly be in the most danger, we suddenly treat her as if she doesn't exist. We all know why. The game was widely praised for making it this way. The fear was that great of the alternative. AI is unreliable, and if its unreliability had a consequence, if Ellie could, through unpredictable, uncharacteristic stupidity, get herself killed, immersion would shatter and you'd be chomping at the bit to remove her brain yourself. I don't know how to solve that. I only know that it's a problem. That Joel forgets Ellie exists when she's in the most danger? That's a lot easier to deal with on the silver screen. Which leads me to this. That's not how it usually is. Usually, The Last of Us as a cohesive work is made better for the combat being the way it is. There's a rage to it, a ruthlessness, an access way to becoming Joel, a means of expressing him. There's a different problem caused by The Last of Us being a game. It has nothing to do with what the combat is, and everything to do with how it's used. The Last of Us believes that there must be fighting every certain period of time or the player will get bored. And the game isn't always able to make those fights appropriate, or useful to the moment, or logical, or even well-paced. This is probably the biggest problem with The Last of Us. Jackson, you're not hungry for action. That's all the prior level was. You're there to see Tommy's world, and to leave Ellie behind, and to chase her when she runs. Now, what part of that benefits from having combat in it? Why are raiders attacking Jackson? I mean, even logically, are they trying to die? The game reveals itself in this way. It's so obvious that these encounters serve no other purpose than to quell fears of lost engagement that it takes you out of the game. Worse, they lengthen the time between now and the next interesting moment. They feel like the game delaying itself. It makes sense to have a fight on your way to Ellie, make you wonder if she's been found, raise the tension. But afterward, after what Joel said to her, the acting is worse in the show, and the sets look worse, and the writing is worse, but at least the moment gets to fucking lie. At least it can resonate, and not immediately be cut short, and have its presence compete for space as you are thrust into yet another pointless gunfight. An hour prior, in the suburbs, you cannot imagine how any passive interpretation of this scene could be anything but a diminishment. An hour later, and it seems so clear. It would be freeing to enter a medium not terrified of taking itself seriously. That terror, and the dipshittery it leads to, are precisely what the cinephile sneers at, what they use to justify their boundless ignorance and prejudice. Now, we've well established that gameplay affects story, so consider the idea of gameplay motivation. Why is this encounter here? If you were writing a book or a screenplay, you'd quickly realize that answering that question is the most important thing you'll do. So apply that logic to a game. Why is this fight happening? You're hoping for a good answer, something with immediacy, electricity, or dramatic stakes. We have to get out of this building, gotta save Joel, gotta save Ellie, gotta get revenge on this particular Muppet. It doesn't have to be complicated. It isn't in Doom. When the answer is good, the gameplay is energized. You fight different. You care. The emotions of success and failure are magnified by the narrative. We can credit The Last of Us for having a lot of well-motivated gameplay. But what does a bad answer look like? Good question. It's a characteristic technique of Naughty Dog's to have a building in the distance to aim toward, and to then be shown every so often how much closer you are, which quantifies the significance of whatever you did to get there, makes progress feel meaningful. It's smart. Effective. When it is supporting stronger motivations, yes. Being the main thing driving you forward? Obviously not. I need to get closer to a building, and there are men standing in my way. That's a bad answer. You could always find a way to put it in more charitable terms, but this isn't an intellectual exercise. Do you feel it? In that moment, does it make you care? Because there are so many fights in Pittsburgh that are just more guys. And if that were all there was to say, then this problem would be a lot smaller than it is. But there's another problem. It's bigger, but it's simpler, and much easier to explain. Sometimes, the pacing sucks. What you expect after a large fight isn't another large fight, but that's often what you get, which in conjunction with bad motivation, and the occasional speck of mediocre level design, means there are parts of this game that are really quite exhausting. The Last of Us had a lot of money behind it. Money doesn't like risk, and it's hard to imagine a time that games were taken less seriously than they were in 2013. So more shooting, Naughty Dog. Jingle those keys. Prove to the COD kids that this is a man's game too. Or maybe it was just that they'd spent the last 8 years making Uncharted. You can tell. Forming a rivalry with a big scary car, being shot at by the big scary car, and watching as every single one of the bullets conveniently miss. That's the kind of thing that thrills in the elevated world of Uncharted and makes the grounded world of The Last of Us look really, really dumb. Oh, and we can't forget about the set pieces. Best of them's gotta be when you're hanging out with Ellie, but even there you're given infinite ammo to make it work. The Last of Us looks at realism the same way I look at women who express enthusiasm for Spider-Man Web of Shadows, and it also happens to be a game where a constant awareness of how many bullets you have is a necessity. It would have been less jarring to make me plug in my Dance Dance Revolution mat. And don't get me started on the sniper section. Ah, it's too late. What's your first instinct when you're being sniped? Snipe him back. Incorrect, buzzer. The sniper's firing itself, dipshit. Okay, fine. Sneak round back, up to the attic where the shots are coming from. Uh-oh, no one there. Maybe he's around the corner. Okay, looks safe. Are you stupid or something? He was hiding around the corner? Big ups to Joseph Anderson for having that shit named and shamed so long ago he was probably still nursing his wounds from getting his head kicked in by St. George. So now it's your turn on the gun. The Last of Us thinks, right, I'm a 7th gen shooter. And what is a 7th gen shooter without its on-rails turret section? Perhaps the previous sniper coated the scope with superglue as a mischievous trap, but we can't back out of ADS for some reason, making it nonsensically difficult to acquire targets. Can't move the sniper at more than a snail's pace, so a clicker can stagger faster than my crosshair. Can't do the first thing you'd think to do when the Twatmobile rolls up because apparently they've tricked it out with sniper-proof tires. But the gunner's the brains of the operation, you see. He thinks there's a sniper. So let's stick my head out to throw Molotovs at Ellie's group instead of ramming them with my 12-ton truck. There's a sniper, so let's not at any point think to shoot him with my massive 50 cal turret before sticking my head out. Was there a gas leak? You could call this as much a narrative problem as a gameplay one. Surely it's strange characterization that the Pittsburgh Pussy Patrol would send endless waves of their men into direct sniper fire like the Battle of the Somme. But perhaps it's better to call it a video game problem, because the reason it exists isn't stupidity so much as Naughty Dog's still compromised conception of what a video game like this should be. The Last of Us is not made worse for having stupid shit in it than it would be made worse for not having interactivity in it. And the cinephile is wrong, and the movie game bullshitters are wrong too, but not about all of it. The Last of Us was an example of what video games could do, and sometimes an example of the mindset they still had to rise above. Item 2. As part of the game's exploration of empathy, Joel admits he used to be on the other side of the cruelest ambush we face in Pittsburgh. So are they really evil? Maybe, but we're all just trying to survive. Who's worth saving? Who's worthy of our empathy? Just the ones you know? Just the ones you love? In the ending of this game, that meditation succeeds, but for the rest of it, it doesn't. The Last of Us is caught between two motivations, the higher to explore this theme, and the lower to make it easier to kill your enemies, to make you want to kill them more. So it'll say things like Joel could have been any one of those guys in Pittsburgh as an attempt to humanize them, to elicit empathy for the other side. But everything that I am shown tells me otherwise. Those guys in Pittsburgh aren't just trying to survive. They're wholly evil. They're unnecessarily evil. They don't have personalities beyond evil. Their truck has run written on it despite the fact that they have every incentive to lure their victims in, because the game is more than willing to make no sense so that your enemies look more evil. It wasn't human nature that made me dehumanize them. The game dehumanized them by not humanizing them, because it wanted to make it easy to shoot them. It happens again with David. We've got women and children. We're just trying to survive. But no, then David turns out to be a cannibal rapist pedo, so what was the point in that? Look, there's complexity, but actually, don't worry about it. Character design is characterization. Who is this? A human? No, an enemy. Every man in Pittsburgh reads clearly as a man whose purpose is to be worth killing. Harsh features, dirt, and generic clothing. Nothing about his character design points to any amount of humanity or individuality. This is video game tradition. The ending works, but couldn't it have worked better? What about the design of the Fireflies suggests that this guy was a person beyond his role as generic Soldier 13? What about these men make us believe that we are wasting life in this moment to save Ellie? What about this surgeon suggests the existence of Abby? This, the show did better. Not because it was smarter, but because it didn't feel the need to be dumber, because being dumb was the tradition in games. Which brings us to The Last of Us 2. Oh yeah, the best game ever made. So, yeah, Joel gets his head bashed in, doesn't he? People didn't like that. They didn't like it as a TV show either, because people expect things from sequels. We expect the sequel to make us feel the things the first thing made us feel, and we expect to feel something new. That is an understanding so ubiquitous that it escapes our notice. It's the deal we believe that we have implicitly made with the sequel, based on the fact that original products have to capture our interest on their own merits, but interest in a sequel comes from the audience's connection in the prior entry. I paid money for this because I liked the last thing, so if the sequel is too different, if it fails to deliver on what the audience expects sex from the name, then it is easy to feel that the terms of the deal have been broken. In its capacity as an entertainment product, you could say The Last of Us 2 is a piece of shit right now, and you'd have an argument. But what if I wanted more than entertainment from The Last of Us? Because even as a work of art, Joel's death doesn't hurt any less, but I'm able to see that that doesn't mean the game is bad. The Last of Us 2 is a sequel not to the characters nor the feelings of the first game, but rather to its themes. If love could lead a man to doom the human race to save his daughter, then what, if any, is the next story to tell in this world? Easy. What if the human race didn't like that answer? What if they had daughters too? What is the consequence of what the first game had happen? What it means for Joel to suffer so cruel a fate is that this story might actually work. The Last of Us 2 is interested in hate, and there's nothing subtle about what it wants to say. Empathy is good, revenge is bad. Hop off the cycle of violence. We get it. It takes nothing for the audience to agree with such simple and unoriginal moral statements from a comfortable and clear-minded distance. But The Last of Us 2 is a sequel to a story whose characters we love. So fucking murder them. Fill our hearts with hate, so that we see the world through Ellie's eyes, so that we understand how hard it could be to not set the world ablaze in defiance of what has been done. And let us express those feelings through play. It could tell us, and we'd believe it, and it wouldn't mean a thing. But prove it, emotionally, the only terms that matter. Then maybe it might leave a mark. Maybe we'd really reflect on how easily we could sanction monstrous things, having experienced that firsthand. Maybe we'd really look at how easily our rational surface can break, and maybe we'd recognize how preciously it must be protected. I think The Last of Us 2 was a story worth trying to tell. And guess what? The game is fun. If the first game was like a 7.5, then this one's a strong 8 to a light 9. I don't mean to sound like a man who gave Ultraviolence a 2, and it might seem low of a games critic to resort to a numbered score, but I think a little quantification can really help clarify what is meant by good becoming great. It is the difference between a game that I enjoy, and a game that I enjoy so much that I am happy to die because it means I get to play the encounter again. A game that I come back to for the encounters and for no other reason. But how? It's not obvious. The new weapons are cool, but inconsequential. The new enemies and the improved AI are good, but they won't account for even a fraction of such a large change alone. There is one new mechanic, Prone, and it makes a tactical contribution. Even slower movement than crouch in exchange for even more stealth, and a new way of using cover to access more favorable shooting sightlines. But what really makes Prone important is what it in part enables. The new level design, more realism and better level design. Those would seem to be two conflicting things, but Prone means a defended flanking route could mean some grass, some water, or the underside of a car, just as easily as it could mean waist-high cover. And what could better fulfill the aesthetic of groundedness and grittiness than that? So the levels are big now. That does mean size, but it also means how many options they provide. Games like Metal Gear Solid 5 and Dishonored served as Naughty Dog's muses, and as it is in those games, the player's greater sense of ownership over their pathing choices, both large-scale and small-scale, creates a commensurate sense of ownership over the successes and failures that result from those choices, an incredibly heightening thing. I feel smart for picking the smartest way. I feel less frustrated when I make a mistake, and the navigational decisions I'm asked to make are simply more interesting. This also accelerates movement, if for no other reason than that it removes what slows it down. You'll never have lots of enemies stuffed into a small space. If you do, there'll be verticality to fix it. There's no choke pointing, movement is never stifled. But The Last of Us 2 doesn't want to become a tactical shooter, with a massive creative sandbox, where long-term plans dominate the decision-making process. Not because that would be the lesser game, but because it wouldn't be The Last of Us. So how do you achieve the depth of Metal Gear with a focus on improvisational decision-making? You don't. But you can get close. And that begins with limiting information. We still have listen mode, but it's still not very powerful, and enemies are spread further out through more space, and more complex space, making it very hard to keep track of them. It's also the case that the second game likes to deny the player a clear sense of how big the arena actually is. We take it for granted in most games that when we walk into a fight, our impression of the size of the fight, and therefore how many enemies are involved or where they could come from, is reasonably accurate. In The Last of Us 2, there may be an arena behind the arena that you couldn't see. Another building, another part of a building, another back road. Large, fully modeled interior spaces are their own unknowns, and there are a lot more of those in the second game than there were in the first. You will be surprised by space and by enemies constantly. You will have to make spontaneous choices, and those choices are more interesting than ever. That choice will lead you into the next, and the next, and then the next, because that's just what these levels are. When The Last of Us 2 is great, it's great because of the level design. When it isn't even that much better than the first game, that's because of the level design too. Ellie has no weak fights. Abby has a few. Defending the point is boring. The tracks are okay. The cargo containers are so basic it feels like something I would have put together in Halo 3 Forge. For every weak fight, there are 4 good ones. The Last of Us 2 is remarkably hesitant compared to the prior game to have a fight begin with open combat. The player is almost always undiscovered at the start, and there are a lot of good things that come from that. For one, these are the moments that tactical, creative planning is best enabled. This is what makes it likely that you will take a route through the encounter that truly feels your own. It also means you've probably made progress into the arena by the time you're discovered, at which point you will be surrounded by unknowns, so combat usually begins in its most exciting state. You'll notice that you always start encounters pretty far away from effective cover. The most useful places to be are always much deeper into the arena, attracting you into the tensest positions. That's also why when you're discovered, you're as likely to rush toward the action as away, because that's where the cover is, and that helps to get the chain of spontaneous decisions moving quickly. The dog and the brute are aggressive enemy types, and the more complex level design means there are more spaces from which an enemy could come, so we are more frequently presented with situations that we don't want to challenge head on. It's the oh shit moment, the retreat, an excellent way to prompt exciting, spontaneous choices. But because that encourages a return to stealth, and because it's easier to do so with the abundance of grass and exactly that complex level design, we're also more frequently presented with opportunities to again start thinking bigger. This is The Last of Us, not Metal Gear, but I wouldn't have been against a little more attention to the tool sandbox. Yes, we have the new trip mine. The trip mine sucks. It's really hard to predict where enemies are going to be in The Last of Us 2, and, you know, that's kind of the trip mine's whole deal. When it's not hard to predict where an enemy is going to be, that's because you're close to that enemy. But if you're close, then why use a loud and expensive bomb that might kill you as well instead of a stealth kill? And if you want to use it as a distraction, place it, get away, use the noise to clear a path, we run into the same root problem. It might go off too early, or not at all. Stealth is easy to recover, but hard to maintain, because The Last of Us believes itself more interesting when you are discovered. The big change from the first game to the second is that it's possible to maintain. Full stealth is now a supported playstyle, and that's really cool for different players, for repeated runs, and even if you're discovered, for the time you're not, stealth tends to be a lot more compelling than it was in the original. That's the level design and the new enemies, but I find the tall grass to be a remarkably effective idea too. It's the indistinction of whether or not you're hidden in grass that makes it that way. With solid cover, you're either behind it or you're not. With grass or water, there's no such distinction. You might be, hopefully. It depends. So when an enemy comes close and you can't move, stuck in a position that you really don't want to be discovered in, that's tension of the arse-clenching variety. That's very fun. The Last of Us 2 is better at being tactical than The Last of Us 1, and it's better at being improvisational. And it's better at being The Last of Us, too. What are the words you'd really use to describe it? Not deep. Not reactive, that's design talk. It's thrilling, it's savage, it's mean, it's desperate, and it is elevated beyond comparison by what you might call the surface level. The effects and the animations. In those terms, this is the most realistic game ever made. It's hundreds of millions of dollars made constantly apparent. An impossible collision of gameplay possibility and animation fidelity. There is a flawless animation for like every way you can enter a prone state, every way you could be pulled out from under a car, every kind of close quarters fight. The Last of Us 2 is one of one, and so you notice the strength and the ease of its immersion. There's an immediacy, an intensity that comes from its realism, a fulfillment of the premises and the fantasies of the game. And there's one more thing. Themes. You heard me. Themes. There's this notion that the combat is meant to reflect the themes of the game by doing what the first game didn't, revealing the humanity within the enemies you face and therefore suggesting that any one of these people could be their own Joel with their own Ellie. Combat is meant to feel wrong, evil, and the game couldn't not do this. You can't talk about the consequences of violence, you can't center your story on empathy for the enemy, and then implicitly exclude 99% of the enemies in the game. But does it actually work? Enemies scream, and that can be unsettling. The names of those you kill are shouted in shock, implying their personhood and their relationship to their allies. And that can be effective. Sometimes enemies surrender, you have to reject their application. No one wants to harm a dog. And they've made big changes to their character design strategies. There's still a curious lack of individualizing features on clothing, but what you'll notice about their faces is that they are, for lack of a better word, average, mid, arguably chopped, not harsh, not exaggerated toward masculine or feminine ideals. Instead, they're sort of pudgy and chubby and goofy in the way normal people are. It's remarkable how strange normal looks in a video game, and it works. It's humanizing because it's not dehumanizing. But that's it. That's good. But it's not enough. Grief lasts as long as it takes to say someone's name. Yeah, they scream. for like 2 seconds, and then they're dead. I do realize how much of a psychopath this makes me sound, but come on, did you really have any doubts? And being real, is this not a surprisingly calm reaction to being stabbed in the throat? Is this not a remarkably small amount of blood? I think if you want to tell a story about how violence corrodes the soul, then you have to be willing to make that violence shocking. You have to be willing to disturb the player, as well as, or instead of, exciting them. Death can't be clean and convenient. You can't pull your punches to avoid arbitrary notions of what's gratuitous. Why did no one ever keel over with grief, unwilling to fight me because I'd killed someone they love? Why have I only seen a surrender like twice in 50 hours of play? What better game than this to have enemies suffer on the ground until you make it end? Why was I never ambushed later in the game, motivated by the death of some guy called Tony, who I could only assume was one of the enemies I'd killed in a prior fight? One of the most humanizing features of an enemy is their fear response, the implication that they, like you, don't want to die. For that, among other things, fear was made legendary. Fear brought life to clones in plastic suits. It doesn't in The Last of Us 2. Why not have an enemy hide? Remove the moral safeguard of clear-cut self-defense as Ellie hunts them down to keep their mouths shut. I'd even go so far as to question the use of crosshair kill markers. Without them, death is something you have to interpret from what you can see. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're not quite sure, which creates a tension. Sometimes you fire an extra bullet in a panic. That's grounded, and that's reason enough to do things this way. But it's also the case that reading death from the user interface makes killing less personal, if for no other reason than that it makes the dying that's actually happening in the game less relevant and less paid attention to. I wonder if the problem is as much in the core mechanics. Mechanics are expressions. In The Last of Us 2's combat, they're expressions of survival strategies. But in games like Doom or Shadow of Mordor, there's more to it than that. Some of the mechanics are expressions of hate. There are things I can do in Shadow of Mordor that I have no reason to do other than to be hateful. There are numerous kill animations to choose from a grab I could chuck someone into a fire, or off a cliff, or repeatedly stab them, or feed them to a Caragor. There's even a button that lets you blow your own orcs' heads off, all for no practical benefit. It's the fact that I'm doing it to be hateful that makes it an expression of hate, of Talion's hate, of my hate. And so when I'm doing these things, hateful is how the game feels to play. In fact, playing Shadow of Mordor is the only time I've ever looked back at myself and thought, what the fuck is wrong with me? That's why the gameplay tells the story and supports the story as well as it does. There's good reason to do everything that can be done in Doom, but a lot of the time, that's not really the reason you're doing it. The glory kills are vicious, but it isn't the animations that make Doom feel so dark and brutal. It's the mechanics that allow the player to express the emotion suggested by the story, demanded by the music. And it's the mechanics of The Last of Us 2 that disallow expressions of the emotions that define the narrative and the psychology of Ellie. Mechanically, combat is about survival. That's all this is. That's all it speaks to. That's really cool, but it would make no difference if we were playing as Dina instead, or if these were the encounters of The Last of Us 1. I'm not saying we should have been able to saw people's heads off, but what if you could hold the stealth kill button to drag it out a little bit, make it more intense? I sincerely believe an interaction like that would be more impactful than all the gore in the game 100 times over. The Last of Us 2 looks hateful. It doesn't feel hateful. It sands away the uncomfortable and disgusting parts of violence, and what's left is what we expect from a video game. It's cool. It's fun. It's responsive. We have crosshair kill markers because it's satisfying. It's not what it pretends to be. And it's a problem that the narrative centers itself on a message that I ignore and on a feeling that I don't strongly feel when I'm actually playing the game. It does not do to me what it's meant to do to Ellie, and it really matters that it doesn't. I suppose it's true of any game, but especially of The Last of Us 2, that there's a part people talk about and a part people don't. Most of The Last of Us 2 isn't the story. It's moving through the levels. And the levels in The Last of Us 2 are a very different story. It adds to the plausibility of the world that the levels are allowed to be larger. The Last of Us implies an open world, but it is experienced as a linear series of playable spaces, and it is a testament to the level design team that you rarely felt constrained. It's in being freed that you realize what you didn't have. The difference between a forest in The Last of Us 1 and a forest in The Last of Us 2 isn't visual. It's that I only truly experience a forest as a forest when the path doesn't feel designed, when I'm provided no sense of certainty, when there's a small degree to which I find my own way. For that, a small degree of expanse is necessary. The same is true of a city block, fully realized, hundreds of meters across. So when I'm asked to reach a destination, a distant building like always, I'm participating in that process, not simply moving my character down the only available path, and I feel responsible for the path I take, rather than expecting to encounter enemies on the way for no other reason than that we have moved into the next arena. The Last of Us 2's levels, sometimes by virtue of their openness, do not so clearly define arena. so, no such expectations are created, and we tend more often to simply run into enemies, suddenly hearing a conversation in the distance. Sometimes, openness can solve a more fundamental problem. You know that your experience is linear, and that you can't actually be affected by anything outside the playable space, but Ellie doesn't, and nor should any inhabitant of the world. So there comes an inevitable disconnect when the last shot is fired, the music stops, and the tension is relieved, and you start to look around, all in spite of the fact that making a massive amount of noise in a city infested with soldiers and zombies, and then staying in the same place, should cause quite the opposite of relief. In these moments, I behave as if the world isn't real. In the most open spaces, The Last of Us 2 addresses that problem. But it isn't always that open. It isn't even usually that open. The Last of Us 2 is still a linear game, so occasionally it employs a trick. You might go into one building and then come out sometime later to find the street suddenly filled with infected, implying a connectivity and a continuity that isn't really there. Perhaps it could have pulled that trick a little bit more often, because without it, or openness, the problem remains. It might seem strange to have made it this far into a discussion of openness in The Last of Us 2 and not have brought up the part where it's literally an open world game for an hour. For some people, this is the best part of the game. For me, it's one of the worst. It's too grid-like to be navigationally interesting. Nothing will ever happen outside of the obvious content zones, which feels like a denial of the strengths of the format. And it might also be too big. Given the resource pressure, thoroughness of exploration is strongly encouraged. So when there's this many things to explore, it can feel burdensome. What does the open world contribute here, except the choice of in which order I want to tick buildings off the map for an hour? It's exhausting. I could cut it short, but then I'd be missing out. This isn't where The Last of Us uses openness well. Its value is as an experiment. For a game as obsessed with realism as The Last of Us 2, for a story written so naturally, it's remarkable how bad it can sometimes be at environmental storytelling. A suicide note, spray-painted in dramatically placed installments, whose sequence makes sense only if you happen to start reading from the correct entrance. This is one of those Naughty Dog moments where the contrast is so severe with the standard level of quality that the only plausible explanation is carbon monoxide poisoning, so I'll let them off on medical grounds. But what about everything else? A house can be perfectly composed, but if you happen to find a corpse inside, chances are there'll be a note, conveniently laying out their life story, and surprisingly often, the combination to their safe. I've never been to Seattle, so maybe the crime rate is in the negatives over there, and it's tradition to tattoo your credit card information on your forehead or something. But it does strike me as rather dumb that everybody writes the codes to their safes on pieces of paper that they then leave lying around in the open. You might say, it's the post-apocalypse. What else could Naughty Dog have done? Not make safes a core feature of exploration. The Last of Us 2 still has environmental puzzles that force you to make a jarring switch from real logic to game logic. What it has in addition is the certainty that whenever you find a safe, the code will always be written in an adjacent room. No one might have taken the note out of the room next to where the safe is, no one might have disposed of the note or found the note before you, and no one will ever not have left a note revealing the code to their safe, completely obliterating the high sense of reality that every other part of the game works so hard to establish. That convenience is also half the reason the safe codes are also easy to figure out. I think the best moment I had with The Last of Us 2's puzzles was about a calendar with 3 dates, one of which had to be the combination: a health checkup, an evacuation date, and an anniversary. Well, the anniversary is a permanent and meaningful number, so you figure that's the ticket. But it's not. None of them are. So I thought about it, and I realized you wouldn't commemorate the year of the current anniversary. You'd commemorate the year you met. So you subtract the length of their relationship, 30th anniversary, from the year they would have died, 2013, and that must be the date. I punched it in, and it worked. Hey, that was a decent puzzle. Then I wandered into a room I hadn't remembered to check and found a note that just tells you what the answer is. Turns out, the only good time I had solving a puzzle in The Last of Us 2 was an accident. There's also a rope. The physics are good. It's difficult to have a strong art direction when realism is the chief ambition. Style, then, must be bound hard by what makes sense for a realistic world. But that didn't stop the first game from following the expected logic of matching imagery and atmosphere to the emotions of the story. Plausibility doesn't disqualify the picturesque, or the use of weather to emphasize mood. It's hard to imagine a scene more dramatic and imposing than that, or more idyllic than this. Winter was when times were darkest, and spring was when everything seemed bright. It was nothing remarkable, but it worked. What distinguishes The Last of Us 2 is that its commitment to naturalism is absolute, so its cooperation with the narrative must be completely hidden. Nothing can look like art. Nothing can be the perfect image for the moment, because this world is real. It doesn't know or care about the moment, and it's meant to feel like it doesn't, like you're on your own, entirely unrecognized by the higher power that stylization can embody. So instead, The Last of Us brings us about the mundane. Just a house, just a shop, just a street. Average. Honest, but surprisingly no less beautiful, and perhaps more effective in the sense that it is relatable. It is easier to see ourselves in a normal street than in a perfect one. Likewise, The Last of Us 2 uses something subtler than seasons for its symbology. The severity of water is almost precisely correlated to Ellie's descent into the abyss, overcast with the killing of Jordan and Nick. Then on the second day it rains, and then it rains harder, and then the water through rivers lashes and cleaves the streets apart. By the end, the water is still, her transformation complete. And it works, and this time, it is remarkable. The Last of Us finds a way to have it both ways again. It's powerful art direction that doesn't feel directed. It's brilliant. The levels in The Last of Us 2 are made up mostly of exploration, moving through shops and streets and houses, bedrooms, kitchens and offices, over and over again. There is more of this than there is cutscenes or combat, and I would understand the argument for hating that. Scavenging is still about absent-mindedly mashing triangle in the hope of catching a prompt, and resource management is actually somewhat regressed, because being able to craft certain kinds of ammo makes for boring decision-making. If I can craft ammo, then I'm going to craft ammo. But you know what? There was plenty worth finding in those shops, streets, and houses. We just couldn't use any of it to make a silencer. The level of detail has advanced to the point that it is effortless on the player's part to be convinced that real people inhabited these places. You know what it's like to visit someone's house for the first time? That's what it's like. Again and again. There's this oddly domestic pleasure as you walk through their history and learn who they were, building a detailed portrait from trinkets and memories. Any room I could enter, I did, and I was never disappointed if there was nothing to be found, because simply looking around the room was a worthwhile experience. For Joel, exploration had to be justified with mechanics, but for Ellie, exploration makes its own sense, and its enjoyableness furthers our connection. As she wanders through an unknown world filled with hate, yet still her curious self, she is fascinated by the details and stories that surround her, and we share in a similar experience. The movement and scale of the WLF and Seraphite armies would make the second game a lot less lonely than the first, were it not for the fact that you're so much more often without a companion. The isolation, in its strange way, is haunting and comforting, crushing and freeing at the same time. We yearn for company. But nature doesn't judge, and these feelings are among the loudest in the game. It is a second, simpler story stacked alongside the first. Not truly separate, the game only stands to benefit from emphasizing the emptiness of loss, but still apart. Distant. What most distinguishes The Last of Us 2 from The Last of Us 1 is that distance. So much of this game is just moving through the levels, with atmosphere, with the emotions I've described, but without advancement or even involvement of the core narrative. It's not like the first game. It's not a matter of conflict, it's a matter of absence. And it's not a difficult problem to describe, which risks underselling the scale of it. If your biggest problem with The Last of Us 2 isn't the story, then your biggest problem with The Last of Us 2 is probably the lack of story, often expressed in such terms as the game is too long or bad pacing. It's not hard to make a guess at what might be the cause. For one thing, there's less story for the levels to tell, in large part because this game is a sequel, so the basic facts are established. The Last of Us is grounded and set in a world similar to our own, and the infection is fairly generic and not very mysterious. There are new factions, unknown for large periods of time, who we are very much motivated to learn more about, so that counts for something. But there are two new factions, because in contrast to the first game, whose story spanned the country, most of the second game takes place in one city. This is why Abby's venture to the Seraphite Island is such a breath of fresh air. Houses and the stories told by weathered notes can be fascinating, but they're separate. They don't tell me much about the world I'm in now. And what's for a shop to say besides the fact that it used to sell whatever that shop sold? There's much less mystery for the levels of The Last of Us 2 to unravel. There's so much less for its environments to say. Perhaps more significant is the absence of a companion character. A little more than half the game is spent alone, and that means there's no relationship to be developed through whatever it is you're doing in the level. Then there's the question of gameplay motivation. It's different this time. The Pittsburgh Muppet Coalition were a bunch of self-explanatory douchebags who needed to die because they were in our way. Our engagement with the WLF, however, over is a matter of mystery and a matter of revenge. Each encounter carries with it the hope that we may learn more about them, and as the narrative frames it, that we might get closer to Abby. The revenge part is simpler. These were the ones who killed Joel. Every fight is an act of revenge by proxy. So yeah, I'm pretty well motivated. What's remarkable is that for every advancement it makes toward motivating encounters against the WLF, it takes a step backward with the Infected. Why fight the Infected? Because they're in the way, that was always the answer. But the Infected have horror. Does it make sense that a bunch of dipshit mushroom zombies would provoke fear, whereas armed, intelligent men would not? No, but this isn't a question of logic, it's a question of emotion. The Infected are scary, so escape. That's the motivation. But they're not that scary. In those terms, The Last of Us was always fighting an uphill battle. The sound-based stealth of clickers and the sight-based stealth of runners combined complicates movement choices effectively enough that with nothing but movement and a simple distraction mechanic, stealth is deeply intuitive, reasonably interesting, and adequately tense for the length of both games. Clickers and grass share a common success. It's hard to tell whether or not they've heard you, or how loud is too loud. The indistinction creates uncertainty, and the uncertainty creates tension, which in this case translates to horror. It's a decent foundation, but there's a problem. What happens when you're discovered? You shoot them in the face. Without much bother really, they kinda just line up to be shot on account of being dipshit mushroom zombies. It's one of the more fundamental immersive problems with The Last of Us that the Infected just aren't the threat that the story pretends they are. Oh no, I can't let them find me. I might waste some ammo killing them all. Knowing that what happens when you're found is basically a period of pest control puts a pretty severe limitation on how scary they can actually be. So what makes The Last of Us 2 different from The Last of Us 1? I think it's the story. I think it's a combination of numerous things. The Last of Us 2 is a sequel, so you're familiar with the Infected. The Last of Us 1 had you protect a child, which created a narrative context of exposure, if not a mechanical reality, whereas The Last of Us 2 has you playing a badass, well experienced with the Infected and well equipped to slaughter them. Or an even bigger badass, even more experienced and even better equipped. The biggest difference is that The Last of Us 2 does not treat the Infected as though they are a serious threat. In the first game, it was understood that it was a terrifying thing to be outside the walls, because that's where all the zombies were. The zombies were of consequence, they affected plot, they affected tone, and when they were encountered, everyone took that seriously. So, to a degree, we took them seriously. If they're scared, I'm scared. At least a little bit, because that's what people do. We follow the cues we're given. In The Last of Us 2, the Infected are irrelevant. It is the factional conflict and the central characters of concern to the narrative. The Infected are just there too. If they didn't exist, nothing about the story would change. No one behaves as if they're a threat worth being scared of, or even being cautious of. If costume design is characterization, then what does it say in a world where a bite means death, for Abby facing hordes to completely expose her mountainous arms for seemingly no reason? It is an inevitability that if everyone in this world treats the Infected like a pest, in absence of any mechanical reality to convince me otherwise, that I will think of them that way too, and when I encounter them I will feel towards them as I would any pest, the sigh of being inconvenienced. Oh good, a decent but meaningless encounter, instead of an excellent and meaningful one. The music, written to insist on a horror tone, becomes the equivalent of nagging. They're zombies, you're meant to feel scared, I'm told by the sound, but scared of what? The Rat King was a pretty good encounter, but it's one of like 3 exceptions in a 30-hour game that ultimately left me with the impression that the only reason the Infected are here at all is because it's a sequel to The Last of Us, so they had to be. With the Infected, it feels like The Last of Us 2 is killing time, which feels like bad pacing, which feels like the game is too long. The second game's problems are not the same as the first game's problems. Nothing undermines the narrative, only delays it. And perhaps just as importantly, the encounters themselves do not become exhausting. The gameplay is better and more varied and better paced. It's the difference between a game that could be boring and a game that is never boring. The problem, basically, is that sometimes I would come off the game having enjoyed however long I played, and then not feel particularly compelled to come back the next day. I wasn't hooked, because things were moving at a glacial pace. The strain really shows in the second half of the game, mainly because it's the second half of the game. The narrative is gaining tension, so we expect things to speed up, but also because it's Abby's half of the game. Ellie's story stops when she finds Abby, at which point we experience the time it took to find her from Abby's perspective. So now, we know exactly where we're going to end up. We just don't know how we're going to get there. And that degree of inevitability, a known ending, makes the length it takes to move toward it feel that much longer. But I think the problem is as much what Abby's story is. Consider the game's major beats. Joel dies, Ellie chases his killer across the country, descending with each sacrifice she makes further and further into the abyss. By the end of our time with Ellie, she's double killed a pregnant woman, so you're probably on board with what the story was trying to say. We shared Ellie's vengeful motives, now we feel a little alienated from that perspective, and so the game has made its point. This pursuit has contributed to the world nothing but irreparable destruction. It's in switching to the woman we hate most and humanizing her for the next half of the game that it makes a complete reversal, from hatred to understanding the evil of that hatred, all the way to empathy, and so it therefore makes an effective exposure of what it is about the human mind that the story seeks to critique. It's not just theory, it works because it's emotionally experienced. If anything, the game's central character arc is yours. Thing is though, with The Last of Us 2, you're either going to get on board with Abby, or you're not. If you're not, if you've refused to because she killed Joel, then the story was DOA, and all this is irrelevant. But if you are, then it's probably going to happen long before the eon you spend with her is through. Symbolically, it's fitting for her to have her own half of the game, as an equal counterpart. But narratively, she doesn't need that much time for this empathy to mature. So what else is happening in the story? Answer: a thematic parallel. Abby belongs to the WLF, but she comes to care for an outcast Seraphite. They learn to understand each other as their factions go to war in an act of pointless cyclical violence. It's a mass-scale mirror to the personal conflict at the heart of the game, universalizing its message to a political scale, and it's the means by which Abby comes to understand the darkness of her own part in all this as a mindless aggressor, as a taker of revenge. It's the means by which she is redeemed, lifted above the cycle of violence. And all of that is good, but at this time, is it the most important thing to say? Abby's arc is upward, whereas Ellie's arc is downward, but both characters are essentially exposed to the same lesson, and having been sold on that lesson, the extensiveness of Abby's part of the game can feel less like advancement and more like repetition. Is this pushing the story forward, or is it telling the same story again? I wouldn't argue for removing it, but reframing, restructuring, absolutely. Accepting the popular framing then, the biggest problem with The Last of Us 2 is that it is just too long. I was never bored, but with the first game, I never had to convince myself to come back the next day. I wonder which is worse. So I understand why someone would object to the story, but that doesn't mean The Last of Us 2 is a poorly written game. Characters feel human, dialogue is natural, and they're still making subtext look easy. The Seraphites are a little over the top, like they copied their culture from an issue of Religious Cult Weekly. But even accounting for that, the second game's factions are massively more convincing than the first game's generic hordes of mindless, suicidal video game bad men. It's the human side of things where the cracks really start to show. Abby is a little rough around the edges, but she never convinces you that she's the WLF's top killer in a brutal and protracted war, and nor do any of her friends, all of whom feel like they were plucked from the streets of pre-apocalypse Seattle, like the worst thing they'd ever done was spray paint a cab on a bus stop. The game also falls for the rookie temptation to honor the characters we're meant to like, by making them inexplicably good at doing things. The WLF are a well-trained, equipped, and motivated army. Tommy is a good shot, but he might as well be John Wick for the work he does in Seattle. Jesse's surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered. There's armored cars, sniffer dogs, and he's putting them on their asses, not even breaking a sweat. This is literally just some random guy from Jackson. And yeah, you could just as easily say the same thing about Ellie. Not an inexperienced woman, but certainly not someone plausibly capable of consistently soloing an army, which is what is designed to be likely to happen. But with Ellie, it is more expected, both because she's the player character, but also because she's the protagonist of a revenge story, which turns you into a badass. Everybody knows that. I think this is one of the reasons that revenge bad stories are so often unconvincing. In real life, the result of revenge is a pathetic end, meaningless and abrupt. In real life, Ellie hits a tripwire, or dies to a stray bullet 2 hours in, and then the same thing happens to Dina, and then Tommy, and then Jesse, and the worst thing Joel could ever have imagined has come to pass. But in fiction, revenge has a tendency to be empowering. It's just good motivation. One's ability to achieve their goals is equal to their hatred, and no other story makes a better example of that than this. One where the loss of Joel and the immensity of our hate has through unknown means made us into the Doomslayer, so there's no way to avoid it. A contradicting message is sent. Revenge makes you cool. Revenge makes you powerful. The Last of Us 2 is the most sincere and convincing condemnation of revenge that I've ever known, but that's not really saying as much as I hoped. In excluding the enemies you fight from its ideas of cyclical violence, and now in correlating hatred with strength, it's obvious that The Last of Us 2 is far from the most sincere and convincing condemnation of revenge that it could have been. Why does the lesser story choose a revenge plot? Because it's the easiest way to strongly motivate conflict. Why does it so often then critique revenge? Because it wants to be taken seriously. Because it wants to be seen as having something to say. because it wants to be above its own violence. That's why they're all so unconvincing, because they're insincere. The Last of Us 2 is not insincere. It didn't write a revenge story because it was easy. It wrote a revenge story because it was interested. But it has the same problem, and that's because it's a video game. It's not inherent to being a video game, but let me put it this way. It would be as difficult to sell The Last of Us 2 without traditional combat mechanics that have you fight and kill masses of simple enemies at a regular pace that is the root of all these problems as it would be to sell a major movie without dialogue. The best Last of Us 2 would always be a video game, but the most difficult Last of Us 2 to make was always going to be a video game too. Maybe it should have radically rethought how combat was going to work. Maybe it should have been a horror game instead. Maybe they should have started with a novelization. What's for sure is that there is a better game for this story, and a better story for this game. But the story does have simpler problems, and simpler successes. I like Dina. Bigot sandwiches is a bad line because a term that just so happened to be in vogue with progressives at the time the game was made probably isn't the term an inhabitant of this world would actually use. Not because it's unlikely a lesbian kiss in rural Wyoming would go entirely unremarked upon. Dina serves her purpose as a supporting character well. She's contrast. She's there to make Ellie's change more visible and more meaningful. When Ellie says something over the line, Dina's response makes that clear to the audience. When Ellie puts herself in danger to read a map while they're being pursued, Dina pulling her away highlights her recklessness. We better understand Ellie through comparison to Dina, and Dina means Ellie's choices have a larger consequence. That's why she's there. Soon, it's why she isn't. She's pregnant. She falls ill. She needs to be cared for, but Ellie decides to continue in spite of that, which tells us something about her. It reveals her character. It escalates her change. Then it's Tommy who needs help, but Ellie keeps chasing Abby in spite of that too. And Jesse steps into Dina's shoes to be shocked about Ellie's heartlessness. Ellie's descent works. But don't get me wrong, it's enough. But there's a big difference between that and what it could have been. Part of the escalation of Ellie's change is that she has to hurt people, do increasingly horrible things, like making Nora talk by bashing her head in. The game frames this moment as this monstrous leap into darkness. She's shaking when she returns, her soul forever corroded. But like, why? We've been cutting people's throats by the score. We've killed surrendering enemies, people who begged for their lives. I don't understand why beating information out of a woman who had a hand in killing Joel, who tells us she's proud of that, would be anything more than another body on the pile. Naughty Dog make it worse on themselves by censoring the scene. The camera fixates on Ellie's face, but this isn't a movie, it's a video game. I don't need to see Ellie's face to know how something is affecting her. If I'm doing it and I feel that it's wrong, then I'll know how it's affecting her because I'm playing as Ellie. I'm left to think, yeah, I guess this would be shocking, instead of just being shocked. So not only do I not understand the impact of Ellie's action, I don't feel it either. The other problem with Ellie's arc is that I don't think it goes far enough with her interpersonal conflicts. Ellie argues with Dina, she argues with Jesse, she endangers Dina and Tommy. She's admonished for all these things, but she is also forgiven, universally and almost immediately. And there's never any consequence for her choices, besides the shock and protestation of her companions, that she would have allowed a situation where there may have been consequences. I can't believe you'd risk Dina/Tommy's safety, but nothing happens as a consequence of the fact that she did. They're fine. Jesse dies, so that's something. But there are two problems with this. One, Jesse didn't die as a direct consequence of something Ellie did. Jesse died to bad luck, and he was in that position because of Dina. Yeah, Dina was here because of Ellie, but that's a weak link. It doesn't feel like Ellie's fault. Two, no one gives a fuck about Jesse. Maybe he's too boring. Maybe we didn't have enough time to bond. We sure as shit don't care when he dies. And the strange part is, the moment he hits the ground, it's like he never existed. With an almost cruelly unceremonious death, thus ends the notion of Jesse. No one seems affected by his passing. His own family are a background detail. Even in the game, it doesn't matter that Jesse died. So even if it made sense that Ellie was directly responsible for Jesse being here, we're denied a sense of guilt. We're denied the consequence. And I find that really very strange in a game with such a strong interest in portraying those kinds of consequences. It's broadly true that The Last of Us 2 has a weaker supporting cast than the first game. It's not a problem of purpose. Dina is of use to the narrative. It's a matter of being interesting in their own right. Put Dina next to Tess, and the difference is immediately clear. Tess felt like she belonged in the world she lived in. Dina feels like she knows who Kendrick is. Tess had a far more interesting relationship with Joel than Dina does to Ellie. There is a tension and much unspoken, and it makes us wonder how that will evolve. It's also clear that Tess has a stronger and more interesting motivation than Dina. Tess wants to make her life mean something, but she doesn't want to admit that to Joel. Dina's just tagging along because that's what a good girlfriend would do. It's second-order motivation. She didn't love Joel, and it isn't interesting for a girlfriend to do that. It doesn't tell us about who Dina really is. Dina isn't bad because she isn't like Tess. Better motivation would have helped, but it could have been something else. What she needed was something. The inverse of nothing. Jesse's not so different. A man entirely defined by being nice, and entirely motivated by being fond of Dina. Liking him is effortless. Caring? If his character was any thinner, he might blow away in the wind. Take Mel. Mel is jealous because her boyfriend's into muscle mummies. Yeah, take a fucking ticket. Well, what about Nora? Nora's a twat. We spent about an hour with Manny, but for some reason, Naughty Dog's idea of valuable characterization is repeatedly letting us know that he gets more ass than a toilet seat, and that he's Mexican. Right. Well, congrats, Manny, on both those counts, but I still have no idea who he is. Isaac shows promise, then he immediately dies. And Owen, at least, has something to say. But it's Lev who's the best case scenario. He's a Seraphite, a cult of religious madmen, wishing to drag the world back into the shadows. He's also trans, so his mother cast him out, and she was shamed by her peers for her failure. Maybe he should have just kept quiet. If they find him, they'll kill him. If he returns to his mother, she might do it herself, but he has to save her, because she's still his mother. It's not easy to give up on someone you love. And though it was his religion that led them to this, it's not as easy as casting aside everything he's ever known. It's hard for him to work with a wolf like Abby, as it's hard for her to work with a Scar. Well, there it is. A purposeful character, an interesting character. He's the anti-Jesse, and sadly, the exception. Now let me be clear, there's levels to this. Mediocre for video games is some Assassin's Creed Shadows the Templars stole my sacred hat bullshit with the expressiveness of a fucking turnip. By those standards, The Last of Us 2 looks like Mad Men, but that doesn't change the fact that it suffers where the first game did not, because you do not feel strongly about most of the people in it. Here's another problem. If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself. Why don't they just read a synopsis of the game into the camera? Oh, look at me, I'm solemnly playing an acoustic guitar, I'm so profound. Girl, fuck you. Sorry, I don't know what came over me. Look, sometimes The Last of Us 2 is stupid. What leads Abby to Ellie is a map she dropped, shortly after having killed Owen and spawn camping his kid, which has Ellie's secret base pinpointed in giant blue Sharpie. Now let's just think of all the reasons that's not quite the most intelligent move she could have made. Number one, this is an extremely simple map. Who can't memorize a single location? Number two, if someone were to even catch a glimpse of this goofy-ass map, let alone take it, it would lead them to your pregnant girlfriend. Number three, you literally live in the apocalypse, Ellie. Some amount of forward thinking is to be expected. And that's not to mention you're the daughter of Joel, it's not paranoia if they're really out to get you, Miller, who recently died because he wasn't paranoid enough. So I wouldn't say that Ellie carrying around a top 10 ways to kidnap Dina pamphlet feels entirely in character. Also, why did you leave the lights on and the window wide open in your secret base in the city currently at war that also happens to be like 50 feet away from a horde of raging infected, who last we saw were held at bay by a subway turnstile? Now I know the game likes to memory hole the infected, but this isn't a little bit dumb, it's slapstick comedy. And in a game with this much stuff that didn't need to be there, it is all the more absurd that problems like this were allowed to remain. Then comes the boss fight. Abby versus Ellie. Gay versus might. Eat a box versus box a bitch. Dawn of justice. It's challenging, it's novel, and it's creative, and none of those things are enough. What strikes me the most about how the fight plays is how counterintuitive its mechanical expectations are, given the character you're playing as. You're playing as Abby. She's built like John Cena. Brute strength is her character and her advantage. You're playing against Ellie, who's built like a games critic. You expect Abby to beat Ellie in a fistfight, but she doesn't. She dies, instantly. You get the jump on her, you die. The only way to damage Ellie is to begin the melee from directly behind her, okay? Fine, but you're gonna need to tell me in precise terms that only this will work and nothing else will, because that's not intuitive. There's a bigger problem with this fight. For some of us, something feels off about being forced to play Abby in an attempt to kill Ellie in this moment. Our motivations as the player have been deliberately forced into strong conflict. We like and understand Ellie. Hopefully we like and understand Abby by now too. But Abby in this moment is as taken by hatred as Ellie was at the start of the game, and it is demanded of us as the player that we drive this emotion, but we don't share it. We're not there, not at all. In a passive medium, like the TV show this exact fight is going to be in a couple of years, it's different, because I'm not being asked to take a side mechanically to make the fight play out. In the game, I have to take a side, and the side I'm forced to take is Abby's, for no other reason than that we were playing as Abby 5 minutes ago. The strength and clarity of Abby's drive, paired with my deep conflict, resulted in what I can only describe as feeling alienated from the scene. And one could imagine that this was the intent. Having began the game in complete alignment with the vengeful impulse, and ending it in complete misalignment, we're made to realize how distant we've become from that blind hatred, now that we finally empathize with both sides of the story. That sounds right, but it doesn't really feel like that's what's happening in the moment. The scene directs your attention to what the game is forcing you to do, to the construction of the scene, not the content. I think there was a smart idea here, but I think for a lot of people, it misses, and the stray bullet hits something else entirely. I wonder if it could have been solved with a choice, not one that would affect the outcome, but in being allowed to decide which character we want to win. Based on moral judgment or empathy, or whatever else might matter to you, we'd be forced to interrogate, and at least in part resolve our conflict, thereby allowing us to more easily enter alignment with the character we choose. Eventually, Abby wins. She's about to fulfill Planned Parenthood's buy one get one free deal as payback for Mel, then turn the knife on Ellie. But it's Lev who stops her. There is a way above this bitter cycle, and that's a very nice idea, but it's out of character. There is no way Abby lets Ellie live. Even if her character development would mean she's strongly tempted to, Ellie might come after them again. Ellie will probably come after them again. Abby is now responsible for Lev's safety. Abby just lost Owen. Maybe Abby spares Dina, but Ellie's gonna get that brain removal surgery whether by Father Anderson's scalpel or Daughter Anderson's boot. But she doesn't, for the same reason Dina left the lights on. This confrontation is probably the worst part of the game, but if Neil Druckmann can push a character further along their arc, he's going to keep pushing. So then, the game goes on. Ellie and Dina have settled, and it's beautiful. The sky, brilliant with endless warmth. It stands out because it's the one part of the game that does look like art. It isn't the uncaring, grounded world we knew in Seattle, and the game uses that contrast to emphasize that this is like a dream. This is the result of Abby's forgiveness. Something right. Dina steps into her old shoes as the one for Ellie to sacrifice in favor of her revenge. There's a second Dina now too. At least the character artist remembered that Jesse existed. But this time, if Ellie leaves, there'll be no forgiveness. Dina makes that clear. It's the final decision. The final escalation. Life or death. Ellie chooses death. What's remarkable is that even as you appreciate the evil of what she's doing, even as you shake your head and admonish her, you understand. Naughty Dog take this opportunity to psychoanalyze Ellie. For a moment, it's not about the consequences of her choices, it's about why she's still making them. What makes her need Abby? Even after all this time, even now, living a perfect life. Druckmann wants to explore this impulse and to make us understand it beyond what's immediate and obvious. It's not anger. That fire fades. It's not a matter of wounded pride or honor, as it might have been more greatly for a man. It's trauma. She had to see what Abby did to Joel. That horror still clings to her. She sees it when she closes her eyes. She's in pain and she can't live with it anymore. And it's nothing more than delusion, but maybe killing Abby would make the pain go away. Given a smaller environment, Naughty Dog's ability to use space to externalize the emotions of the character is genuinely remarkable. The way the silence and then the wind sparks this anxiety that you can't quite explain. The cries of the sheep as you heard them. This strange worry that you missed one. An echo of the fear that something good, something innocent might again be lost to the cruelties of the world. The darkness of the barn, the anticipation that the door will shut behind you. It works so well because none of it's certain, and none of it feels intended in the moment. There's enough room for doubt that it could just be nothing. So your conscious mind is with Ellie, pushing along, just keep talking like everything's okay. But there's this feeling deeper down sneaking up on you in this really organic, believable way. You're not just escorting Ellie through her trauma, you're experiencing it firsthand. And I think it's something Naughty Dog really needed to do right. Because for most people, Ellie's situation isn't that relatable. Everybody loses people, but not like Ellie did. Everybody can understand revenge, but not beyond rage and pride. And so for the second time, a Last of Us game ends with a monstrous act that we cannot condone, but that we completely understand. California is home to some of the best encounters in the entire game, against by far its least interesting faction. But this is the ending, and for that reason alone, the last thing I want is to have to fight a bunch of generic evil goons just because they're in the way. Motivation? Zero. They might know where Abby is. Well, that's really got me fired up. I don't think anyone would have the game without this section because it's just too fun, but it really could have done with a revision. Ellie finds Abby and Lev strung up in the bay. She cuts them down. Abby walks away, uninterested and too tired for this fight. And Ellie follows, automatically, thoughtlessly, without any feeling behind it. She absently staggers after them, almost as if to suggest she has become like a zombie, just another fang in a world of chattering teeth, something less than human. She is empty. She is a woman who chases Abby. There's nothing else left. She presses a knife to Lev's throat to make Abby fight. We understand the totality of Ellie's self-abandonment. It's not a good fight. It's boring, clunky, and protracted. And I don't think all that can be justified, but it is a good thing that in this moment, you're not having fun. When Ellie has Abby at her mercy, a memory of Joel flashes into her mind, and she breaks. She lets Abby go. She slumps in the water, cold and wet and completely alone. This is the ocean floor, the bottom of the abyss. And for my final act of contrarianism, I think it's brilliant. Ellie is here because she sees no other way of making the pain stop. But it was never going to work. This was never going to heal her. She could kill Abby right now and Joel would still be dead. And that image would still be screaming in her head. For this fight to feel pointless in the end is right. That's the point. This isn't redemption. And it isn't forgiveness. It's not what it's accused of being. It's acknowledgement of a defeat that was born the moment Ellie abandoned Dina to come here. There was never any point to any of this. So Ellie returns to an empty house, silent and cold, claimed by the wind. She lost her fingers. The music won't come. She's broken. And that is the final statement of The Last of Us 2. Yeah, it's a pretty good story. It suffers from massive execution problems, but ultimately, it does enough to sell its central ideas. It could have made a far more persuasive argument. It could have been a far better game, but it doesn't fail. It works. I liked it. The lowest part of me might have wanted an excuse to call it overrated trash, but it's not, and neither is the first game. The Last of Us games inspired what they inspired because they are inspiringly good, and they are not to blame for the fact that those that rode their coattails didn't do it as well. I came, I saw, and I said, yeah, I get it now. The Last of Us doesn't deserve less praise, it deserves less talk. That's the irony that I realize now at the end of my feature-length discussion. It feels almost obligatory to have a take on The Last of Us, because there's levels to popularity and The Last of Us is gaming's Game of Thrones. It's inescapable. It sucks up all the oxygen. It's not so interesting to deserve that. Not because it isn't good enough, but because nothing would be. There are so many wonderful things to see, so many remarkable achievements, and among them, The Last of Us deserves nothing less and nothing more than a place. Special thanks go out to Elle Hudson, Lex Williams, Andre Baltuta, Holy Shift, Dennis Williams, Combat Wombat, John Lemley, Dylan Schaefer Murphy, Have a Nice Day, Dan Walker, DJ, Week Sentry, Chino, Chase Baker, Dogs Ain't My Pancreas, William Vossler, Joe Simmons, Arcturus, Navy Husky, MT the Poet, Dr. Pavel, Carlos Skibber, Enzo, John C., Ethan Seach, Fat Guy 688, Purple PP, Joshua Lovejoy, James Kittle, Cole Bramlett, Walshy, White Light Best Girl, Tedmaker Kafka, New XC, Very Professional Dodo, Douglas the Excessively Anonymous, Nikita Shoshin, Dog Best Dog, I echolocate my husband using your voice, Nebulous Rascal, Bumble, Grumble, Double, Crumble, Bumhole, Pummel, Shovel, Puddle, Huddle, Jumble, Tidemore, L.A. Lockwood, Anna Haig, Fox Hunt, Christopher Scher, Eddie, Rams, Daniel Tankersley, Oh My God Why 2, Darkest, XD Shadow Frog, Chan, Triplicate, Pugsley the Fourth, Majats, Microlapse, Edward Franklin Woods, Crane, Virgil's JCE, Plague BT, Cave Snail, Geo and Sutton are goated at Arkham, Matin NG, Jim Hobbs, Corn Sugar Drop, Lise Killies, Linz, Only Linz, and Wojciech Muszelkowicz.